The day I buried my mother, I got a phone call that changed everything. It wasn't condolences. It wasn't a sympathy card. It was my sister calling to tell me that our mother had changed her will 3 days before she died and left me absolutely nothing. 26 years I spent caring for that woman. I bathed her, I drove her to chemo, I held her hand through every single night she cried in pain. And while I was doing all of that, my own sister was sitting in an attorney's office quietly stealing every single thing I had ever worked for. But here's the part that will make your jaw drop. That wasn't even the worst thing she did. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart pounding, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. We tell these stories every single week, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Hit the like button too. It takes 1 second, and it means the world to this channel. And I need you to tell me something in the comments right now. If your own sibling did this to you, completely betrayed you after everything you sacrificed, would you fight back or would you walk away forever? Drop it below, because by the end of this story, your answer might completely change. Let's get into it. My name is Linda Carroll, and I want you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not a dramatic person. I have never been the kind of woman who posts her feelings on social media or makes scenes at family dinners. I'm a registered nurse. I've spent the last 27 years of my life watching people die with dignity, holding their hands, keeping them comfortable, being the steady voice in the middle of chaos. That is who I am: calm, practical, reliable. So, when I tell you that what my family did to me broke something inside me that I'm still trying to put back together, I need you to understand the weight of those words, because people like me don't break easily. I'm 50 years old. I live outside Columbus, Ohio, in the same modest ranch house I bought 22 years ago when I was a newly divorced mother of one. My daughter, Cassie, is 28 now, and she's the single greatest thing I've ever done with my life. That girl is sharp, kind, fiercely loyal, and honestly, the only reason I got through the worst year of my life with my sanity mostly intact. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. I grew up in a small town in rural Ohio with my parents, Harold and Dorothy Carroll, and my younger sister, Renee. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. My father worked at a packaging plant. My mother stayed home and managed the house with military precision. She was not what you'd call a warm woman. She didn't give hugs freely. She didn't say, "I love you," without occasion. But she was fair. Or at least I believed she was fair for most of my life. Renee was 3 years younger than me, and from the very beginning, we were complete opposites. I was quiet and serious. She was loud and charismatic. I got good grades and worked a part-time job through high school. Renee got into trouble at parties and somehow always charmed her way out of consequences. My parents adored her for it. I think they were genuinely entertained by her in a way they never quite were by me. I was the responsible one. Responsible is never as exciting as charming. I put myself through nursing school on a combination of scholarships, student loans, and sheer stubbornness. I got married young, at 22, to a man named Dale, who seemed steady and turned out to be anything but. We divorced when Cassie was just 2 years old, and from that point forward, it was just the two of us. I worked nights, I worked doubles, I moved back close to my parents for childcare help during Cassie's early years, and I told myself that was the right thing to do. Family first. That was the rule I lived by. Renee, meanwhile, floated through her 20s like smoke through a screen door. She married twice, both times badly. She had a son, Tyler, who was a sweet kid caught between two parents who couldn't stop making terrible decisions. She borrowed money from my parents regularly. Nothing massive, just enough to always need a little more. 500 here, 2,000 there. My parents always said yes, and they never mentioned it to me. I only found out how much later through documents I wasn't supposed to see. My father passed in 2014 from a massive heart attack. No warning. There one day, gone the next. It gutted all of us, but I think it gutted my mother in a very particular way. She'd built her entire identity around being Harold Carroll's wife, and when he was gone, she didn't quite know who she was anymore. She was 68 years old and suddenly adrift. That's when I made the decision that would define the next decade of my life. I started looking after her. Not in a casual way, in a serious, structured, deeply personal way. I started spending every Saturday at her house. I took her to doctor's appointments. When she was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2017, I became her primary caregiver. I researched her treatment options. I drove her to chemo every single week for 14 months. I sat in that beige waiting room reading the same magazines over and over while the poison dripped into her veins, and I told her it was going to be okay, even when I wasn't sure it was. She went into remission in 2019. We cried together in the car in the hospital parking garage. It was one of the most honest moments we ever had. Renee visited during the cancer treatment a total of 4 times. She lived 40 minutes away. Things changed in 2021, and I should have seen it coming. That's the thing about hindsight. It makes you feel like an idiot not to notice what was right in front of you. My mother's cancer came back. Not breast this time, lung, stage 3. The oncologist was honest but not hopeful, and my mother, to her credit, faced it with a kind of grim pragmatism that I found both heartbreaking and admirable. She knew what was likely coming. She began talking about arrangements, about the house, about what she wanted done with things. These are conversations I'd helped families have dozens of times in my nursing career, and yet having them with my own mother was completely different. I sat across from her at her kitchen table and talked about end-of-life wishes like I was screaming on the inside. Around this same time, Renee suddenly became very present. Suspiciously present, though I was too exhausted and too focused on caregiving to pay close enough attention to what that actually meant. She started calling my mother every day. She started dropping by during the week, which she had never done before. She started taking my mother to lunch, to appointments, to the hair salon. My mother seemed pleased by the attention. She smiled more when she talked about Renee's visits. Something in me bristled at it, but I told myself I was being ungenerous. My mother was dying. If Renee finally showed up, wasn't that what mattered? Wasn't that what I had always wanted? For Renee to step up, to be present, to share this weight. I told myself to be grateful. I swallowed the suspicion and kept working double shifts to cover the time I was spending on caregiving. I noticed the attorney first. His name was on a business card I saw on my mother's kitchen counter in February of 2022. Gerald Haskins, estate planning attorney. I asked my mother about it, casually, I thought, and she said Renee had recommended him to help her update a few things. I said that was probably a good idea. I didn't push further. I had a dying woman's medication schedule to manage and a full-time nursing job and a daughter who needed me, and I was running on 4 hours of sleep most nights. I didn't have the bandwidth to be suspicious. That was my first mistake, but it wouldn't be my last. In the spring of 2022, my mother's condition declined sharply. She moved to hospice care in May. In-home hospice, which meant I was there even more. I took a partial leave of absence from work. I slept in her guest room 3 or 4 nights a week. I managed her medications, her meals, her comfort. In those final months, she and I had conversations we'd never had before, about my father, about her regrets, about what she was proud of. She told me I was the most dependable person she had ever known. She squeezed my hand and said, "I see you, Linda. I always did." I believed her. God help me, I believed her. She died on July 14th, 2022, a Tuesday morning. I was holding her hand. 3 days after the funeral, I got the call. I was at home. I had barely slept in a week. I was sitting at my kitchen table in the same clothes I'd worn the day before, drinking cold coffee and staring at a sympathy card from a coworker when my phone rang. Renee's name on the screen. I answered, expecting grief, expecting something human. She said, "I need to tell you something before you hear it from someone else." Her voice was controlled. She'd rehearsed this. She told me that our mother had updated her will in March of that year, 4 months before she died. The house, our childhood home, that my mother had owned free and clear for over a decade, was to go to Renee entirely. The savings account, approximately $140,000 that my father had spent his entire working life accumulating, had already been moved into a joint account that Renee had opened with my mother 8 months earlier. The contents of the house, the personal property, the car, all of it. Renee had been named sole executor, which meant she controlled every single piece of the estate's administration. My inheritance was a single line in the new will, a small antique dresser that had belonged to our grandmother. I sat there for so long that Renee eventually said, "Linda, are you there?" And I said very quietly, "Did you do this? Did you manipulate her into this?" And she said, and I will never forget this as long as I live, "Mom made her own choices. You should respect that." Then she hung up. I put the phone down on the table. I looked at the sympathy card. I sat completely still for 45 minutes. And then something cracked open in me that had never cracked open before. I'm a nurse. I've been trained to stay calm under pressure. I've watched people receive devastating news and I've stayed present for them, steady and grounded. I've never had a breakdown at work. I've never allowed myself to fall apart in front of a patient or a family member. But I fell apart that afternoon in my kitchen, alone, and it was the kind of falling apart I didn't know how to come back from. I called Cassie. She came immediately, dropped everything, showed up within an hour, and sat on the floor with me while I cried in a way I hadn't cried since my divorce. She held me and didn't say anything for a long time. She's wise like that. She knows when words are just noise. When I finally could speak, I tried to explain what had happened, and even saying it out loud felt impossible, like describing a dream where the logic doesn't quite translate to waking life. How do you explain to your own child that your mother chose to reward the daughter who showed up 4 times during 14 months of chemotherapy over the one who showed up every single week? How do you make sense of that? Cassie listened to everything. Then she said, very carefully, "Mom, I don't think this was Grandma's choice." She said it so gently, but those 7 words hit me like a freight train, because the moment she said them, I knew she was right. I had known it, somewhere underneath my grief, from the second Renee's voice had come down the line sounding so controlled, so rehearsed, so ready for this conversation. My mother was 68, terminally ill, on significant pain medication in the final months of her life. She had been isolated from her usual social circles. She had been visited constantly by a sister who suddenly appeared after the years of absence. She had been steered toward an attorney she had never met before, recommended by that same sister. This wasn't grief I was dealing with. This was a crime scene. And I had been too tired and too sad and too trusting to see it. Cassie convinced me to call an estate attorney the following Monday. His name was David Park, and he came recommended by a colleague of mine whose family had gone through something similar. I walked into his office with a folder of every document I had: caregiving receipts, pharmacy records with my name on them, appointment records, text messages, the original will my mother had drafted in 2018 after my father's death. The 2018 will was very different from the 2022 one. In 2018, the estate was to be split equally between Renee and me, a 50-50 division of everything. That had been my mother's standing wishes for 4 years. David reviewed everything I brought him, asked me a series of very specific questions, and then leaned back in his chair and said something I wasn't prepared for. "David, the timeline here is very concerning. Have you seen the medical records from the period surrounding the will change?" I hadn't, but I was a nurse, and I understood immediately what he was getting at. I requested my mother's full medical records from her primary care physician and her oncologist. I had every legal right to them. I had been her healthcare proxy, a fact Renee had apparently not considered when she was orchestrating all of this. What those records showed stopped me cold. In February 2022, the exact month the attorney's business card appeared on my mother's kitchen counter, my mother was placed on a new combination of medications, including a significantly increased dosage of an opioid painkiller. Her physician's notes from that period documented what he described as mild to moderate cognitive fluctuation, which is medical language for her mind was not consistently clear. The will was signed in March 2022, 1 month later. There was more. In reviewing the pharmacy records, David's paralegal noticed something. The prescription for my mother's medications during that period had been picked up by Renee on multiple occasions. Renee, who had also been the one driving my mother to the new attorney. Renee, who had co-signed the joint account with my mother 6 months earlier. But the real twist, the thing that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, came from my mother's neighbor, a 74-year-old woman named Gloria, who had been my mother's closest friend for 30 years. When Cassie stopped by to tell her what happened, Gloria got very quiet. Then she told Cassie something she said she hadn't known whether to bring up. She said that in the winter before my mother died, she'd heard raised voices from my mother's house during one of Renee's visits. She said she'd heard my mother crying, and she said that a week after that, she'd seen my mother standing on her porch looking, in Gloria's words, scared and confused. When Gloria asked if she was all right, my mother said, "I just need to do what she says, Gloria. It's easier that way." She had been afraid of her own daughter. When David Park started formally investigating the financial records, we discovered something that made everything fall into place and made me feel both vindicated and absolutely sick. Renee had been in serious financial trouble for over 2 years. Her second divorce had resulted in a significant financial settlement that she had burned through faster than anyone knew. She had 2 maxed-out credit cards, a lien on her car, and, this is the part that floored me, she had taken out a personal loan against her own life insurance policy. She was in over $60,000 of debt when she started visiting our mother more frequently. She hadn't come back for our mother. She had come back for the estate. But it was even worse than that. When David requested financial records as part of the contestation process, we discovered something that made everything fall into place and made me feel both vindicated and absolutely sick. Renee had not simply transferred the joint account she had opened with our mother after death. Over the 14 months between the account opening and my mother's passing, someone had been making systematic withdrawals, small enough not to trigger automatic flags, large enough to matter. The account, which should have held approximately $140,000, held just over $91,000 when my mother died. Nearly $50,000 had been drained quietly while my mother was alive, while my mother was dying, while I was sitting in that beige chemotherapy waiting room holding a purse full of her insurance cards and reading old magazines. We filed to contest the will on grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity in October 2022. Renee hired an attorney, naturally. She also, apparently, told the rest of our extended family that I was money hungry and couldn't accept that Mom made her own choices. I know this because cousins I had known my entire life suddenly stopped responding to my messages. Family court is not like the legal dramas on television. It's slow and procedural and exhausting. There are depositions and motions and discovery requests and delays. There were weeks when I was so tired of fighting that I considered dropping the whole thing, and it was Cassie who kept me anchored each time. She reminded me that this wasn't just about the money. It was about what had been done to my mother, about the fact that a dying woman had been manipulated and frightened into betraying her own firstborn child. The deposition was when I truly understood who my sister had become. Renee walked into that conference room in a tailored blazer and a calm expression, and she answered every question with polished, evasive precision. Yes, she had helped her mother with estate planning. No, she hadn't coerced anyone. Yes, their mother had made her own decisions. She's convincing, I'll give her that. She's always been convincing. But David had done his work well. The attorney who drafted the 2022 will, Gerald Haskins, was deposed as well, and under direct questioning, he admitted something that became the turning point of our entire case. He had met with my mother only 2 times before drafting the will. Both meetings had been attended by Renee. My mother had never met with him alone. In estate law, that is a significant red flag. A standard ethical practice for attorneys handling wills is to meet with the testator privately, specifically to ensure there is no undue influence. Gerald Haskins had not done that. And when David's team began investigating his background, it turned out that Gerald Haskins had been the subject of a state bar complaint 3 years prior for a similar situation involving an elderly client. He had not been disbarred, but the complaint was on record. Gloria testified via written statement about what she had witnessed and heard. My mother's oncologist testified carefully because he took his professional obligations seriously about the cognitive fluctuation documented in her records and what that could mean for decision-making capacity. The pharmacy records showing Renee picking up medications were entered into evidence. The financial records showing the systematic withdrawals were entered into evidence. And then David entered something I hadn't even known existed. A voicemail. In January 2022, 2 months before the will change, my mother had called my cell phone and left a message that I had saved without realizing the significance. I had been at work and couldn't answer. In the voicemail, my mother's voice was quiet and slightly slurred from medication. She said, "Linda, it's me. I need to talk to you about something. Renee is telling me things and I don't know if they're true. I'm confused, baby. Can you call me when you get a chance? I love you." I had called her back that same evening. I remembered the conversation now. She had seemed fine on the phone, or at least fine enough. And when I asked what she wanted to talk about, she said she couldn't remember. I had assumed it was a medication fog moment and let it go. But the voicemail was time-stamped, it was documented, and it told a story. The judge heard all of it. The ruling came in April 2023, 9 months after I'd filed. 9 months of legal fees, sleepless nights, strained relationships, and the surreal experience of having my own grief put on public display. The judge ruled that the 2022 will was invalid. The grounds: insufficient evidence of independent decision-making capacity at the time of signing, combined with procedural failures by the drafting attorney and documented evidence of a pattern of undue influence. The estate reverted to the 2018 will, 50-50 split. But there was more. The financial investigation into the joint account withdrawals had been referred to the county prosecutor's office. In August 2023, Renee was charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a felony in Ohio. The charge covered the approximately $48,000 in unauthorized withdrawals from the joint account during the period my mother was alive and declining. She took a plea deal. She avoided prison time. She was given 3 years of probation, required to pay full restitution, and required to complete community service. I know some people think that wasn't enough. Some days I think that too. Gerald Haskins, the attorney, faced a formal state bar complaint that David filed on my behalf. His license was suspended for 18 months pending review. His reputation in Columbus's estate planning community was effectively destroyed. Renee paid back the $48,000 in restitution, slowly, through a garnishment arrangement because she didn't actually have the money in cash anymore. Exactly where it went, I still don't fully know. I received my half of the estate as specified in the 2018 will. The house sold for substantially less than it would have a year earlier, thanks to the market shift, but I received my share. The savings account, minus what had been drained, split equally. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. People who haven't been through something like this sometimes imagine that justice brings relief, a clean, satisfying snap of resolution. But what I felt, mostly, was grief. Grief for my mother, who had spent her final months afraid. Grief for the sister I had grown up with, who I had defended and forgiven and made excuses for my entire life. Grief for the relationship I had wanted with my family that never actually existed in the way I'd believed it did. I'm telling this story now because something unexpected happened 6 months ago, and I think it's the part that matters most. Renee's son, Tyler, my nephew, who was now 26, reached out to me. He'd grown up watching his mother make terrible decisions, and I think watching what she did to our mother and to me was the final thing that helped him understand who she was. He sent me a letter, actual handwritten letter, which surprised me. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't known what was happening at the time, and that when he found out the full extent of it, he was ashamed. He asked if I would ever be willing to have a cup of coffee with him. I said yes. We met at a diner near my house on a Thursday morning, and I sat across from a young man who had my mother's eyes and looked absolutely exhausted from carrying something heavy. We talked for 3 hours. He told me things about what she had been like behind closed doors, the financial desperation, the paranoia, the way she'd framed everything she was doing as being in my mother's best interest. He told me he'd had to get distance from her to see clearly. I don't know what kind of relationship Tyler and I will build. I don't know if it will be anything at all in the long run. But I know that sitting across from him felt like finding a piece of my family I hadn't expected to recover. My relationship with my sister is over. I don't say that with anger anymore, mostly just a kind of exhausted clarity. Some things, once broken, cannot be repaired, not because forgiveness isn't possible, but because forgiveness doesn't require you to rebuild what was never truly solid in the first place. I can forgive Renee for what she did to me. I can forgive her for being a person who chose greed over her own mother's dignity. What I cannot do is pretend that makes her someone safe to have in my life. What I carry with me, and what I hope you take away from this, is this. Pay attention to the people who suddenly appear when things get valuable. Watch who shows up during the hard parts versus who materializes when there's something to gain. Those two categories of people are rarely the same, and the difference between them will tell you everything you need to know. I am 50 years old. I have my daughter. I have my work, which has always given me meaning. I have a small house in Ohio that I bought with my own hands and my own stubbornness. And I have the knowledge that when my mother needed someone to be there, really be there, I was. Every single week, every single appointment, every single night. No one can ever take that from me. Not even a changed will. This is Linda Carroll. Thank you for listening.